Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. Happy Sunday, everybody. You've found your way to Part 4, the thrilling conclusion of It Was a Face Out of Hell, the shooting of Patrolman Masterson. And that's right, I did say Part 4, so if you haven't heard Parts 1 through 3 yet, get on it and then come back and join us. I'll save you a seat. I'm going to rewind the story just a little bit to let you sink back into the narrative. And with that, please do join me now as we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may. Part 4, the thrilling conclusion of It Was a Face Out of Hell, the shooting of Patrolman Masterson, starts now. Martin took him aside and told him that they were on a mission connected with the New York City Police Department, but that he couldn't go into any more detail. Van Auken could explain to his family and his guests that they'd find out what it was all about the next day. While talking to Van Auken, Martin grinned at their natural curiosity, and they looked a bit sheepish. He couldn't tell them everything yet because the news that they had come to pick up a couple of murderers with orders to bring them back dead or alive would have kept them awake for the whole night. "What I came down here for," Martin said aloud, "is to ask you if you'd have your clerk call us at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning." "The clerk that'll call you," the proprietor laughed, "will have to be an alarm clock. That's what the bear hunters use." Martin and the others got up at 5 a.m. It was pitch dark and cold as the grave outside on the porch where they waited for the automobile, which didn't show up until 5:30. The driver was sleepy and incurious. He might have been just so many logs for all he cared. Even when they ordered him to stop halfway between Thendara and Old Forge and wait until daybreak, he obeyed with all the indifference of an automaton. Indeed, he was just about to snuggle his nose down into his deep, well-worn collar for another snooze, when they jerked him awake to attention and insisted that he should listen carefully to their instructions. Martin told him who they were and what they were about to do. All he received in reply was a grunt, so he let the driver go back to sleep while they waited for the dawn. It was mighty cold just sitting there. Martin, Donahue, and the others were just about frozen stiff before the first gray clouds changed to crimson that swiftly streaked across the crests of the snow-covered mountaintops. They woke the drowsy chauffeur and ordered him to drive along the road until he reached the steep incline that led to Camp Utica. He started his engine with a racket that sounded loud enough to awaken the dead and then proceeded slowly along the crusty highway to the point below the camp where he stopped. "Now wait here for exactly 10 minutes, Donahue ordered. "At the end of that time, drive like the devil up to the lodge." "Uh-huh," he agreed indifferently. "10 minutes be long enough?" "Quite," Donahue said grimly. "At the end of 10 minutes, we'll all be very happy, or else..." As they stepped from the coupe, Frankie Teed drew his revolver and, jokingly shouldering it as if it were a musket, chuckled, "Lafayette, we come!" This struck them as rather funny. Nothing quite so hilarious as a Revolutionary War reference, I guess. They had been sitting with the marrow freezing to their bones and nothing to think about but the desperate encounter they knew they faced at the top of the hill. And the sight of Officer Teed, the grotesque, cocky little man that he was, strutting along in front of them sent the whole bunch into a fit of laughter. They hadn't dared to drive up the hill for fear the noise of the rattling car would herald their arrival, so they scrambled up the icy slope as best they could. Careful as they were, it was so quiet that early Monday morning that it was impossible to deaden altogether the sound of footsteps. On each side of the narrow road there were hills of snow 3.5 feet high, which obliged them to keep on the hard-traveled path. As prearranged, the troopers took their positions at opposite corners of the bungalow. Everything, from that moment, worked at top speed. They tore open the screen door and with one concerted lunge smashed the inner door off its hinges. It fell inward with a deafening crash. Indoors, they were faced with dense darkness, relieved only by the faint light of early daybreak that seeped in through the entrance. Guided by the sound of a creaking bed, they dashed through the first doorway to the right of the living room. Fortunately, Martin had borrowed a flashlight from one of the troopers. He snapped it on, and it lasted only long enough to disclose a man on a cot near the wall, reaching for a gun. With one leap, Donahue was on top of him, and the pair were engaged in a desperate struggle. Officers Brady and Teed, who had followed them into the room, darted to Donahue's assistance and handcuffed the furiously cursing man on the bed. All this took only a few seconds, after which Donahue and Martin rushed through the living room in search of the second bedroom, almost colliding with a terror-stricken young woman clad in an elaborate negligee. They had calculated every step by the description given of the interior the day before. Martin's collision with Mrs. Peterson spoiled his count, and he passed a pair of curtains that led into the bedroom and found himself in the kitchen. That blunder, as shall be explained later on, saved Martin's life. Whirling around, he corrected his error. 2 leaps brought him back to the curtains, which he brushed aside with his right hand, at the same time firing a shot into the black space on the other side. The entrance was very narrow. To pass through it would have been suicide. Martin's shots were returned with a volley, which he returned by emptying his gun in the direction of the flashes from the unseen thug's weapon. As the last bullet left his revolver, he felt a red-hot streak shoot across his hand and arm, and in an instant the hand was wet. "He got me," Martin whispered to Donahue, "but it's only a scratch. You keep firing at him, and I'll wing him through the window." As Martin ran around the house toward the gunman's window, he was tying up his hand with a handkerchief. Trooper Coburn, who in strict obedience to orders had remained at his post, whispered, "Geez, you're wounded? Let me have a go at him." Martin shook his head. If anybody got out through the back window, they were sunk, and he couldn't wait to explain his maneuvers. All this was taking place during a fraction of a minute. Martin grabbed the trooper's gun and gave him his own to reload. The windowsill was about 10 inches above the heavy snowdrifts that piled up against the side of the house. Footing on the frozen crust was precarious, to say the least. As Martin crawled up on its surface, each toehold sank deep into the soft snow beneath. The shade was up about 6 inches, which gave Martin light enough to make out vaguely the form of a man who was crouched behind the bed. At the instant Martin observed the man, his gun was trained plumb in line for Donahue's heart. If Donahue had remained in the spot where Martin left him, it was nip and tuck between them. Martin emptied his gun through the window pane straight at the murderous hand. In the flashes, he saw the body leap into the air, and then he fled. Once he reached the window, Martin would be at his mercy unless he made good his escape. Less than a minute had elapsed from the time they'd first broken into the cabin. During that time there had been a steady stream of firing. In the silence of that isolated spot, it sounded like a bombardment of machine guns. When Martin again rushed through the shattered front entrance, he was met by an oppressive silence, broken only by the agitated tones of a woman's voice and the low, murmured commands of a man. Glancing in the direction where he'd left his partner, Martin could see only his face, a dim white splotch in the gloom. His dark, overcoated body merged with the blackness of the curtains. "Force that fellow to walk in front of you and make him enter the back room," Martin suggested to Teed, who was standing by the handcuffed man. The prisoner presented a sorry figure. Dressed only in underwear, his body shivered in the icy cold bedroom, while perspiration oozed on his face, and his long hair hung dank on his forehead. Beneath heavy eyebrows, his eyes peered out gloweringly, and his lips curled back over his teeth in an ugly snarl. Teed dragged him out into the living room. So far, so good. But underwear doesn't give a man much of a grip, and with a vicious wrench, the gunman tore himself loose and raised his manacled hands in an effort to dash out the detective's brains. Brady caught him in time. "Go on," he ordered, taking a firm grip of his shoulders and attempting to shove him along. "I won't," the prisoner sniveled. "If I do, Tippy'll shoot me." "Don't let's have any more shooting. I'll go," the woman volunteered in a spunky but rather shaking voice and started to walk up the passage. "It's your bungalow," Martin said to her as he reached her side. "Mind if we burn him out?" "No," she whispered. "Do anything you like. I don't care what happens to the camp if only nobody gets killed." When they were near the room, Martin saw Donahue drop down on the floor. "If you won't come out, I'm going to set fire to the place," Martin said loud enough for anyone inside to hear. Then, addressing the man inside, he called out, "Come out or you'll get smoked out." No answer. So dead was the silence then that they could hear the clock ticking inside. Mrs. Peterson thrust her head through the hangings, saying at the same time, "It's me, Tippy. Let me come in and talk to you." She shrank back convulsively. "Oh, I can't see him. He's not there. Perhaps he escaped through the window." "No," Donahue said in a whisper so low that Martin had to lean down to hear him. "He's lying on the floor. Maybe he's stalling." Martin conveyed this information to Mrs. Peterson, and she took another look. "Oh, yes, I do see him. He's got blood all over his face, and his eyes are staring wide open." Detectives Brady and Teed had come up by this time, dragging their prisoner with them. "Let's go," Martin said. In a leap, Donahue was on his feet, and together they swooped down on the man, or the body of the man known as Walter Tipping, alias Tippy Murray, otherwise dubbed Whitey. Whitey's body was stretched out along the bed. In his right hand, a revolver was clasped. One of the men switched on the light, and it required no doctor to tell us that Tippy was dead. The fatal bullet had entered the side of his head, which was turned toward the window as he aimed his bullet straight at Donahue's heart. Martin's first bullet must have struck his arm, and the unexpected flank attack had obviously caused him to spring to his feet, the second bullet entering his temple. While the police waited for their chauffeur to show up, Mrs. Peterson put on some coffee and dressed Martin's hand, and Donahue got in touch with the authorities. The man in Teed's custody was Peter Sellier, alias Ulah Taylor. In struggling with Detective Teed while the handcuffs were being secured about his wrists, he'd knocked a revolver off a hook at the back of his bed. This was picked up from the floor. Upon examination, it proved to be the one which had been torn out of Masterson's holster as he lay dying on the floor of the speakeasy back in New York. They were all seated in the kitchen, just about to raise cups of steaming coffee to their lips when they heard someone dashing through the living room. They sprang to their feet and confronted the phlegmatic chauffeur, his eyes bulging with excitement and his mouth gaping open. "Geez," he drawled. "I've read a lot of stuff in the papers about doin's in New York, but hearing and reading 'em's something different. I thought all hell broke loose." Let's give the chauffeur a hand for not quitting his post, for over his coffee he admitted that he'd expected an army of gunmen to come tearing down the hill and commandeer his car for a getaway in a proper gangland fashion. When the authorities arrived, everyone present was arrested on a technical charge of homicide and held under nominal bond. In searching the bungalow, they found that the 2 bullets which had not found a resting place in Murray's body had ricocheted off the bedpost and continued through the thin rock plaster walls of the room, through the kitchen, and spent themselves in the bathroom wall. Donahue had been in danger not only from the gunman's bullets, but also from Martin's. There was a gun hanging in the framework of the closet at the entrance to Murray's room. Had they wasted more than half a minute between the time they crashed the door and reached the curtains that served them so well, Whitey would have had the drop on them, and there would have been a different ending to this story. They discovered half the jewelry taken at the stick-up on 103rd Street, secreted in the photographs secured by adhesive tape to the top board above the highest record shelf. The rest was concealed in the same way in different places throughout the bungalow. The doctor arrived and officially pronounced Tippy Whitey Murray dead. Incidentally, he washed out Martin's wound and gave it the necessary attention. Now, here's what was meant when we spoke of luck in blundering past the curtains and entering the kitchen by mistake. Had Martin known that the curtains led into the bedroom, his natural action would have been to sweep them back with his left hand and fire with his right. This would have offered the concealed gunman his heart as an excellent target. As it was, Martin swept aside the curtains with his right hand which held the gun, and the hand received the shot. Martin had had another equally miraculous escape that trip, but he didn't learn of it until some time later. The coroner, a wonderful fellow named Dr. James W. Graves of Herkimer County, not only released them immediately, but after performing the autopsy gave them permission to ship the body to New York at the expense of the New York Police Department. This cost the city of New York about $75, whereas had Dr. Graves been one of those chaps out for publicity, he might have insisted on having all our witnesses brought up there for trial. It can easily be figured up how big the bill for their traveling and living expenses would have been. Dr. Graves was very enthusiastic over the way the capture was made and wanted one of the revolvers found in the cabin for a souvenir. Martin told him they could not give him that, but that he would see that he had a souvenir of the case later on. This they presented in the form of a special .38 Smith & Wesson on which they engraved, "Presented to Dr. James W. Graves, 1928, by the New York Detectives Bureau." Well, that was a pretty stiff battle, and the police had some uncomfortable moments, but they faced worse when they returned to New York. The case of the Speakeasy stick-up was reopened in the newspapers, of course, and the story of the Adirondack battle widely featured. Martin was sitting in police headquarters early one morning when Mrs. Sellier called to see him. It was a tough interview. She was such a sweet old lady, and she just wouldn't believe that her son was a murderer. "Not my boy," she insisted. "You must have made a mistake. He's a good boy and so brilliant. Ask any of his teachers or professors. Maybe he did go around with that other man, though. But I don't believe that. But he wouldn't kill a man. I know my son, and I know he wouldn't do that." "Well, of course," Martin offered. "If he is innocent, then that'll come out in the trial. They've got to prove that he did it, you know. A lot of men are tried for murder but never convicted. There are plenty of people, though, that know he went around with Walter Tipping, and your son can help us a great deal by telling us the names of the members of Tipping's gang." Mrs. Sellier left, considerably cheered up by the conversation. By the time the trial came up, Martin figured she'd be more used to the idea, and the shock of her son's conviction and punishment wouldn't be so terrible. But it was hard to sit there and listen to how bright she thought her boy was, and how hard she'd worked to send him through high school and college. Sellier denied that he'd shot Masterson. He insisted that it was Tipping who'd killed the patrolman. Tipping's lips were sealed forever, of course, and now that the horror of that scene on the morning of January 31st had somewhat evaporated, the police didn't find their witnesses so eager to help. Confronted with the well-groomed, scholarly-looking young man who assumed an innocent and martyred air, they were inclined to shake their heads and say they were not sure who had shot Masterson. But there was no uncertainty in the mind of Miss Helen Grayson, the girl who was shot in the shoulder by Whitey when Masterson attempted to draw his gun. "That," she said, pointing her finger at the ingratiating Ula, "is the man who fired into Masterson's body when it was lying on the floor. I would know him if I met him in hell." The ingratiating smile on Cellier's face changed like a flash into a demonic snarl, and he attempted to leap at the girl. Another witness who was present immediately recognized the metamorphosed scholar and identified him as the man who had murdered Masterson. But it is only in fiction that mortals are all bad or all good. At first, Cellier absolutely refused to name the other members of the gang. The police could hold out for him no promises of leniency in return for the information. He was headed to the chair and he knew it. There were no extenuating circumstances. For days he remained sullen, speaking to no one. Then, and what changed his mind no one knew, he sent word that he wanted to talk to the chief. Martin was present at the interview. Like many crooks, Cellier was careful of his appearance. His mother had supplied him with plenty of clean linen and kept his clothes well pressed. So, the young man who confronted them that afternoon was as neat and well groomed as any prosperous young businessman ever was. "Sooner or later," he said, dropping into a chair near Inspector Carey's desk, "you cops will get Jerry Callahan. And I want to tell you that he had no hand in the shooting. He was just a poor dopey kid. He had a gun, but he was so nervous he couldn't hold it because his hands were shaking so, and I thought he might shoot one of us. I don't know where he lives exactly. It says somewhere on 9th Avenue in the 50s. His dad works in the post office. If you're gonna get him, I'd as soon you got him while I can put in a good word for him. You see, he overheard Tippy making plans one evening in the speakeasy, and Tippy insisted on his joining to keep his trap shut." Detective Winkleman was assigned to pick up Jerry Callahan. He visited the Board of Elections and looked through all the C's. He found several of that name, but only one who gave his occupation as that of a letter carrier living in the district Cellier named. Inspector Shea in the General Post Office was interviewed and immediately sent for the mailman, who was struck dumb when the detective's mission was explained. "There's a mistake somewhere," he mumbled. "My kid's at home sick with tonsillitis. He's a good kid, you'll see." But one glance at Jerry's terrified eyes when the detectives approached his bed showed there was no mistake. He was a great, overgrown, gangling youngster, 5'11" of weedy skin and large bones. Jerry never served time. He lost his mind and was sent to the Matawan Hospital for the criminally insane. Cellier professed to be ignorant of the fourth man's identity. He was just a guy that Tippy picked up one night when they got to chewing the fat in a speakeasy, was the way he put it. He was boasting about several jobs he'd done. I didn't know what they were, for I wasn't listening. I thought he was a great big gas bag, to be honest. No, I couldn't describe him. "Was he with you after the stick-up when you went out to Mrs. Peterson's place?" Martin asked him. Cellier looked at him sharply. "He was not. We were all friends. He was just an ordinary pickup, I tell you. I don't know where Tippy was going to join him to divvy up." And that was all the police ever got about the fourth man. Somewhere or other, he's floating about in the underworld. Someday he may again be chewing the fat and boasting, and that day, someone may hear him mention the 103rd Street pickup as one of his exploits. Then, perhaps, the police would find him. Now, before this story finishes, we need to make clear Mrs. Peterson's part in it. At the time the news and the feature stories were printed, she was given a pretty bad break. It was said that Mrs. Peterson was the sweetheart of one of the gunmen and that they'd had a quarrel over some other girl. Then, in revenge, she decoyed Tippy and Cellier to her bungalow and sent their address to the police, which was all rot. When Inspector Carey questioned her, the young woman gave him a perfectly satisfactory explanation of how she became mixed up with the mob. "On the night of December 21st, I met him and Tippy. I had a girlfriend with me. About 2 o'clock, they asked us if we'd mind waiting while they drove over to get some gin from their bootlegger. My husband was down south, and there was plenty of room in our house, so we planned to run out there to finish out the night. They were gone only about an hour, and when they returned, they had 2 other young men with them, and we all drove out to my place. I saw that Pete looked very nervous, and I asked him what the trouble was. He said nothing. The next day, we drove about for a bit, and on the way home, about 6:30, Tippy telephoned. He'd been doing a lot of telephoning that day. When we got in the car again, he whispered something to Pete that made him seem even more nervous than ever. I insisted on knowing what the trouble was, and Pete told me that Sunday night he and Tippy and another chap had been in a speakeasy on West 138th Street when the place had been held up. Someone blamed Pete for shooting a man named McGlynn, trying to frame him. They would have to hide somewhere, Tippy said, until the police got the ones who had really committed the crime. It never entered my mind that they would do such a thing, and quite naturally I offered them Camp Utica. We had dinner, and then the boys went to town to pack up. I met them before they left on the 1:45 a.m. train to Camp Utica. Then I joined them a couple days later. The rest you know. And now I'll tell you about the second lucky escape that Martin had during the scrimmage that took place at Old Forge. He wore a new suit that day when he went up to the Adirondacks. In fact, he'd put it on for the first time the night they left New York to pick up the men. The bullet that had skipped over Martin's hand and arm tore through the cloth of the sleeve and the lapel, and he took it to his tailor with orders to repair it. As they always do, the tailor carefully examined the entire garment. "Look here," he said. "There's another hole on the left side." Martin looked and saw a small scorched hole in the coat just outside the inside breast pocket. It made his blood run cold. He took a leather case out of his pocket and examined it. There, he saw the dent made by the bullet. Tippy had had a chance at his heart after all, but he'd been saved by his leather identification folder. Cellier, alias Ula, went to the electric chair. When the police honor board convened, Detective Martin received its most coveted prize, the Department Medal of Honor, and his partner Stephen G. Donahue was given the equally distinguished Daniel B. Freeman Medal. James H. Masterson, who had been murdered in the line of duty, was not there to receive his Department Medal of Honor, but it was presented to his relatives. All the other detectives working on the case were cited for honorable mention. Until Thursday, I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.